I come from a large family. There are 10 children in my mother and father's family, 9 boys, 1 girl. Now, if you're talking about conflict, that would be a synonym for the Hinkle clan. Because throughout our growing up years, we had some pretty good conflict. You might even call them fights. In fact, my mother and father often would call them that. But over the years, we stayed together as a family. Even though we had differences, we were family. If someone from outside of our family came toward one of us in an obtrusive way, then we stuck together as a family because we were family. Even today, when we get together after we've grown older, we have differences of opinions. We sometimes fuss, don't quite come to fisticuffs anymore. But even in the midst of all of this, conflicts of all sorts, we are still family. It is family that keeps us together, and in the spite of conflicts and differences, it is family that will last and cause our relationships to continue. My side of the argument is clear. Yours is occasionally confused.
My side of the argument is logical. Yours is sometimes irrational.
My side of the hassle is justified. Yours is frequently unwarranted.
My side of the conflict is crucial. Yours is often unnecessary.
Someone has said that churches are in one of 3 stages. Number 1, they're fixing to fight. Number 2, they're fighting. Or number 3, they've just had a fight.
Considering the diversity in the church, it's not surprising that we find some conflict. Look at the differences that God built into us as people. We have different values, we have different likes and dislikes, we look different, we're at different stages of growth in our maturity. And look at the differences that God built into us in terms of His gifts. Some of us have the gift of exhortation, some of us are teachers, some are givers, others are leaders. Each area of difference defines an area for potential conflict. The more diversity there is in the church, the more likely it is that we're going to conflict.
Certainly the church is made up of diverse people. And sometimes, though, that diversity causes such conflict that we're a little like this fellow in the picture. We want to pick up our staff and run, and go to some other area, avoid the conflicts, avoid the hassles, avoid the difficulties that come in the local church. With all the bag going on sometimes, there's got to be a better way.
Do we have to homogenize the church? Or is there a better way to deal with the issue of conflict?
We are one in the Spirit, we are one in the Lord. We are one in the Spirit, we are one in the Lord. And we pray that our unity may be restored. And they'll know we are Christians by our love, by our love. Yes, they'll know we are Christians by.
Getting ready to fight involves a certain attitude toward the subject of anger. For many people, anger is a real bad thing. For many, anger is a sin. But anger is not necessarily that bad.
In fact, in Ephesians, the 4th chapter, Paul writes to those Christians and tells them, be angry, but don't sin. Which at least implies the possibility of becoming angry, of feeling this emotion, and yet dealing with it in such a way that a sin is not committed.
Jesus also expressed anger. In Mark 3 and verse 5, He looked around with anger. So anger is not necessarily a sin. Anger does have value. For instance, it keeps things from getting boring. Without anger, their life can be very boring. In fact, some people look at conflict in the local church as something to avoid completely. But without conflict, according to Newt Maloney, the church might have peace and harmony, but very little vitality. You see, anger stirs the juices. It keeps things happening. It stimulates change. In fact, one sociologist recently said, no social advance has ever taken place without heated dispute.
Conflict not only stirs the juices, it also stirs our thinking process. It stirs our understanding of the truth. One of the things that impresses me most about the teaching of Jesus is that very often it is within the context of conflict that He forces people to reevaluate their understanding of the Scriptures. He forces them to look at the Scriptures, but He uses their anger and He uses conflict to help them come to a better understanding of what God says.
Tim, another value of conflict, in anger particularly, is that it gives us a chance to exercise our spiritual muscles. Unless muscles are exercised, we become flabby. Our physical muscles, when we press our hands together, we stress, and it causes our muscles to do something. And so in conflict, we can put stress on ourselves, and it causes us to be healthy. We have flexed our spiritual muscles.
I think about that passage in Proverbs that says, as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. I think another benefit of being angry, if we deal with it properly, is that we can deal with some things within ourselves. There's some personal benefits. One of the things that happens to us when we have this idea that anger is sinful is we decide to suppress anger. And we do a pretty good job of suppressing anger until it gets to the point we can suppress it no longer, and then watch out, because here it's going to come. But when we as Christians feel a freedom to express anger and to deal with it as it comes, we're going to be much better off personally, and we're going to be much better off in terms of the church.
Dealt with constructively, anger or conflict has a potential of drawing people closer together.
But dealt with destructively, conflict also has the potential of driving a wedge between people that may never be removed.
The way that we handle anger is going to be a determining factor in our relationships. In fact, I think it is accurate to say that relationships rise or fall on the basis of how we handle anger. If we suppress it, if we drive it away, or if we explode, then our relationships can be hurt. Sometimes when you read an article in the newspaper or magazine, or perhaps read a good book, you're prone to say, hey, that fits me. That's a description of the way I am. A few months ago I was reading a book entitled New Ways of Managing Conflict, and I was brought to the realization is in the description of conflict that the Leicherts were giving in this book, that is an accurate description of us. I would like for in the next few minutes to take us through what is called in the Leichert book the win-lose pattern. There's a necessity for us to understand what the win-lose pattern is so that we can avoid the win-lose pattern. In fact, any time that we develop a pattern of win-lose, we are destroying ourselves and the church. Now, the American way of life is some win and some lose. But that's a destructive way to look at the church, because every soul is precious in the sight of God and Jesus who died for them. So when we look at the pattern of church direction, we need to realize that the win-lose pattern is not the proper pattern to follow. Now, there are several ingredients that the Leicherts give to the win-lose pattern. The first is a cohesion that mounts against the enemy. As the conflicts start and the group sets out to win, group cohesion rapidly mounts, and the group begins to close rank against the enemy. They know who the enemy is, and they are joined together to defeat the enemy. That's the process of the win-lose pattern. And when the win-lose pattern goes in this direction, we know that it's going in a destructive direction. Closing rank against the enemy is a devilish tool to make us think that our brothers and our sisters are enemies. We need to learn who the enemy is. The second step that the Leicherts give in regard to this pattern that is developing is that the power structure then will begin to form. Leadership becomes more concentrated with the more aggressive, or those who express themselves better, and they begin to take over. And the power structure in this group becomes clear and establishes control. Now, the problem with this is that those who are the most vocal, those who are the best spokesmen, those who can figure it out a little more quickly, become the power structure. And when they become the power structure, then we are 2 steps in the direction of the destructive win-lose pattern. The third thing that the Leicherts give in regard to this win-lose pattern is diversity is snuffed out. The deliberative processes of the group becomes accelerated with less and less time permitted for disagreements and for questioning alternative solutions. Finally, the diversity in the outlook, the way that people look in these things and the way people feel about them is completely snuffed out. And when it is snuffed out, then the attempt is toward the achieving of unity by not even looking at alternate solutions. The fourth thing in the Leichert method, after diversity has begun to be snuffed out, is that within that group itself there develops internal strife. The subjugation of differences and refusal to permit disagreements and their constructive resolution lay the groundwork for internal strife after the win-lose battle is over. So what happens is there is more fighting. You see, there is a power structure, but then the internal strife becomes eternal, I guess, and there is more and more infighting within the group. Group cohesion then has to continue to draw its ranks tighter and tighter. And that leads us to the next step in the Leichert model of the win-lose pattern, and that is that objectivity is eliminated. Now, what we're talking about here is that judgmental and perceptual distortions occur and become progressively greater. The solution of one's own group is seen as superior. The solution of the other group is seen as distinctly inferior. When measurable differences are there, the solutions demonstrate that the superior, the one that our group has decided upon, is the best. And so there is no careful looking at other alternatives, and objectivity is totally eliminated. Now, when objectivity is eliminated within a group becomes very hardcore. Their biases, their prejudices become so great that most groups cannot handle it completely, and the group will even grow smaller. But when objectivity is eliminated, then that leads to the next thing that the Leicherts say, and that is perceptual distortion. Perceptual distortions are extended to each group's view of the other. I am convinced that my view of certain groups is so perceptually distorted that I cannot even form an objective evaluation. And the reason that this happens is that within our groups, perceptual distortions become the way of life. Anytime these judgmental and perceptual distortions occur, the solution to one's own group is still seen as the only way for life. As conflict continues, similar distortions develop and grow in each group's perceptions of the representatives of the two groups. Their own representative is seen more and more favorable. The enemy is represented less and less so. After the perceptual distortions occur where we are perceiving wrong things about each other, and what we're talking about is a difference of opinion that started out very small, but the pattern developed. And it can occur between two individuals, it can occur between two groups, or it can occur within a group. But after the perceptions have been distorted, then there is room for intellectual distortions. Distortions then will begin to occur intellectually as well as perceptually. Many biases occur in our memory. We begin to forget who we are, where we are, and we tend to overlook those things that our group does and magnify the things that the other group does. These intellectual distortions can grow. Each group begins to study and understand his own proposal better than that of the other, even after careful study of the other's proposal. In fact, I am convinced that even if we sat down to study some of the facts of the case in other groups, that many times we have such intellectual distortion that we cannot come up with a fair appraisal of them. The win-lose pattern has become destructive to our perceptions and to our intellect. Finally, the Leicherts say that at the end of this win-lose pattern, there develops the winner comes to the top. The winner is elevated. Representatives of both groups are put under pressure to win. There are great pressures not to be objective, not to be innovative, and not to seek the best solutions, but to win at any cost. This is done by jabbering, or perhaps I should say parrying, jabbing, confusing the issue, probing the weaknesses of another. I once saw or heard of a man who was walking around with a tape recorder, and he was listening to a sermon. And somebody said, "What are you listening to? A good sermon?" He says, "No, I'm listening to this sermon because I know there's something wrong in it, and I've got to listen to it 3 or 4 times to make sure that I know what's wrong." Well, my observation of that is simply if you have to listen to it 2 or 3 times to find out what's wrong, maybe there's not that much wrong in it. But see, what happens in this is that we begin to probe the other person so carefully, and we make sure that the winners on our team are the best probers. And so the best person, the winner on our team is going to be the best person in argument and debate. And that's not always the most productive area. Representatives who win are treated as heroes. Those who lose are viewed as traitors or weak. And so the win-lose pattern has developed, and the destructiveness in the local church has become full-mounted. Now what's going to happen if we develop a win-lose pattern in the church, or if we allow it to continue to develop, because all of us recognize that there are many churches that have this win-lose pattern. Well, first of all, we've got to avoid it at all cost. Jesus got away from this win-lose pattern. He would not allow himself to be drawn into the petty arguments and try to become the winner and to be elevated. He simply continued to be himself under God's love. That's the way we are. Because, you see, if we continue to develop the win-lose pattern rather than the win-win pattern, there is one final conclusion that must be looked at. And that is, in the win-lose pattern, both sides lose. There is no winner, and there are just losers. In the win-lose, it should be described as the lose-lose. Because in that pattern that develops within a home, or within a church, or within a group, both sides lose.
James, as I listen to you talk about this win-lose situation, it really is descriptive of us at times, isn't it? And I wondered, you mentioned a win-win situation. There is an alternative to what you were describing before, isn't there?
Certainly is, Tim. One of the things that we're going to do in the next two sessions is to delve a little bit more deeply into that subject of the win-win pattern. What I wanted to do at this session was simply to say we are destroying ourselves by developing a win-lose pattern, and that destructiveness is going to continue until we break ourselves of that pattern. The thing that I want us to do at this point, Tim, is simply to look at ourselves and to view ourselves as we really are and try to do something to improve ourselves, because, as usual, the biggest room in anybody's house is the room for improvement. There are some things that are necessary if we're going to solve problems. Before valid problem solving can take place in the local church, there's going to have to be some attitude changes and some other things. Let's discuss that just a little bit, Tim.
I would think one of the things that would be needed if we're going to deal constructively with conflict, if we're going to solve problems, is getting ready to solve problems by getting to know each other first. One of the things about a honeymoon, here is a time when a married couple can get off by themselves, get to know each other better, develop a relationship, but all of that, in one sense, is just getting them ready to fight. Getting them ready so that when they get back home and face the bills and face the problems of everyday life, they have a relationship to base that conflict upon. Maybe we in the church need to do a little honeymooning, and during times of relative calm, perhaps we need to spend some concerted time and make a concerted effort to get to know each other better and develop the kinds of relationships that will stand conflict later on.
And I think also, Tim, out of getting to know each other, we learn to trust each other. And before valid problem solving can take place in the local church, there has to be a certain amount of trust. Now, if you were to look at trust, trust is fostered by certain activities and certain attitudes. Let me suggest some things just for your thinking. First of all is affirmation. We trust people who affirm us and who make us feel good. It is important that we begin to affirm each other in the local church. The second is confidentiality. If something is told to us in confidence, it needs to stay that way. We need to trust our brothers and our sisters in the church. And then openness and honesty would be the third and fourth things that I would suggest, so that we do not hide in the church behind a facade, that we don't veneer ourselves or put on false faces and try to be something that we're not. But openness and honesty is so very important if we learn to trust each other and develop an area where we can solve problems. And then next I would suggest sensitivity. Because learning to be sensitive to each other, sensitive to myself, sensitive to you, sensitive to other people in the church, and this is the way that we can overcome all of those differences in likes and dislikes, if we can be sensitive to what's going on in the lives of others. And then finally I would suggest accountability. We have to be accountable to God and to each other for trying to solve problems, not trying to create problems.
You remember, James, back at the first of this session, we talked about the diversity that exists in the local church, all these differences between ourselves and other members of the church. I would imagine one key to finding a place where valid problem solving can take place is going to be learning to accept one another. We spend most of our time in our marriages and perhaps in the church trying to change each other, trying to make our differences, trying to make your differences more like me instead of letting you be who you are. If we can learn to accept each other, that'll go a long way towards letting us solve problems validly. Someone once said, friendship is the loving acceptance of another's uniqueness. We need some of that in the church today.
These things are necessary if valid problem solving is going to take place in the local church. Knowing each other, trusting each other, and accepting each other. But none of these, and may I repeat, none of these can be accomplished without spending time with each other, both in the assembly and outside.
We are one.